actually feel it. Then they're kind of rolling up. So you're in charge tonight?
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
I like the little one. I know, I'm just like, neighbor, there should be something between them.
You know, you may need it to keep the crowd.
Maybe they're supposed to be passed together. Pass something.
Right. Are we good to go?
You think Mike will mind if we use his gavel? Courtney?
Is this Mike's?
Yeah.
Oh, it's special?
Courtney, think Mike will mind if we use his gavel?
No, take it home if you want.
We should carve his initials in it. Well, you know, it's kind of
It's Cindy's.
interesting.
The little one is Cindy's gavel.
Oh. We'll make sure we put it back.
Okay, so I got 7:01, ready to roll. Okay, we can call the meeting to order, please. And then we'll move to item number 2, approval of the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carried. And item number 3, approval of the minutes, the March 15th, 2018 Planning Commission minutes.
I'll move that we approve the minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Motion carries. Moving on to item number 4. Public hearing. Do we just have to note that there's nobody at the public hearing?
There are no public hearings tonight.
Then we just move on to the next item. Okay, moving on to item number 5, new business, solar ordinance. Cindy.
Thank you. In your packet is a draft study and a draft solar energy system ordinance. The City Council reviewed this draft at a work session, their second meeting in March, as well as the meeting before that in March, and provided some feedback on it. One of the significant discussion areas for the City Council was whether or not to allow ground-mounted solar energy systems in residential areas. So say somebody's backyard or side yard or whatever, but mounted on the ground instead of on the roof. The draft ordinance that's in your packet is the same one that the City Council saw at their work session a month ago. And what that is recommending at this point in time, subject to any changes of the Planning Commission and the Council, is a few things. First off, that no principal use of property can be used for solar energy systems. And what that's really looking at is those community solar gardens that you see primarily in rural areas, that you can't have that be the sole use of a property in the city. However, the way the ordinance is drafted, it would permit solar gardens in commercial and industrial zones, primarily contemplating that they could be an accessory on buildings that have enough square footage to allow for a roof-mounted solar garden. So think something like Mills Fleet Farm, where the building itself is 260,000 square feet. There is plenty of space on the Mills Fleet Farm building, just as an example, to do a community solar garden on top of the building in that location. And then it is, as currently drafted, would allow for roof-mounted solar energy systems as an accessory use to residential properties or any other commercial property as well. And so that would be solar panels mounted on a roof. It could be literally a solar array that's sitting on a roof that's incredibly visible. It could be something that blends in a bit more like some of those new Tesla roofing panels that are coming into the market now. But those ground-mounted accessory solar energy systems are not currently included in this draft of the ordinance, and that is something that the City Council is looking for your feedback on whether you think they should or shouldn't be allowed, and we can have that discussion in a few minutes. The process involved in this, there is no public hearing on this tonight. This is for your preliminary feedback. We would schedule a public hearing at your May Planning Commission meeting, and then the City Council would consider the ordinance on June 4th at their meeting. So again, really two topics for discussion tonight. There's that general, that very specific one, I should say, about whether to allow the ground-mounted solar panels or not. If you're inclined to think that they should be allowed, we can also talk about items such as, should there be restrictions on where they're allowed in terms of extra setbacks, restrictions that maybe they can only be in rear yards, not visible from public streets, maybe a limitation on the size of the panels. There's all kinds of ways that we could potentially restrict them if you thought they should be allowed. And then any other changes to the draft ordinance that you have questions about or want to look at in more depth or differently, and we can talk about both of those. So with that as an introduction, it looks like Jim wants to say something. So
Okay, so the picture you're showing here would be a ground-mounted one.
that's a ground-mounted one.
Why do we want to not allow ground-mounted ones?
You know, it's a topic that comes up in other communities as well. Some communities treat them just like any other accessory structure, such as a playground set or a shed in the backyard. As long as it meets the setbacks for accessory structures, they don't necessarily treat them differently. Some communities put different restrictions on them, largely based on a visual basis and a perception of how they will look to neighboring property owners. And then other communities are completely silent and haven't addressed solar energy in their ordinances at all. Primarily, the reason that I have heard come up is related to the visual impacts of those, and Courtney might be able to share some of the city council discussion as well on that topic.
So when we were reviewing this, the discussion that we had, there's one individual who feels that the technology is changing too quickly, and for that reason, something like this, the impact could be minimized if we waited just a little bit longer to kind of see how the technology develops. I think there's also a concern about something like this. It has the potential to produce a fair amount of glare. So if that's in somebody's yard, and depending on how the yard is situated, having the glare kind of go into someone's home and kind of bounce back into the neighboring homes was also some concern. And you can't really screen these because they need sunlight. So depending on, you can't put up a 12-foot fence, well, just period in Carver, but you can't
put up a big shade tree or whatever.
There's no way of making these invisible, and they're quite sizable once they're put up. I think those are some of the arguments that we heard.
Is there any evidence on the glare? I mean, I guess I've never heard that claim, but
The claim comes up quite a bit regarding the glare, and that's one of the
I know it comes up. Is there any evidence?
I think some of the older technology had a little bit more glare. There is treatments that they can do to minimize or make sure that there isn't the glare. But that would have to be something that was specified in the ordinance as well, to make sure that people didn't use maybe some of the other technologies. There is a way to mitigate the glare.
I'm not planning to put any solar panels in my backyard, but I have a south-facing bluff in my backyard that would be perfect for solar panels. And I don't think there would be any problem even screening it from my neighbors.
Right, but could you put them on your roof?
I could put them on my roof, except my wife won't let me.
Right, so that,
But I could put it in my backyard as well. And there are other things you could put in your backyard that people wouldn't like, but
aesthetically, like. But currently, we can put it on our roofs now or not? We don't have an ordinance that says that we can do that either?
Our ordinance today is extremely minimal.
Okay, narrow.
And so accessory, you could probably put it on the roof today.
And I was going to say, Jim, what you're saying is kind of what the pro argument was amongst council, is that, well, maybe I don't like my neighbor's swing set, shed, above ground pool, but I don't complain about that kind of thing, so this would be
Right, but-
perhaps just one more thing in a backyard.
But I think I understand too, I mean, when I read through this, at least originally, like HOAs kind of determine some of those things as far as if, and I don't really know, like trampolines or above the ground pools and whatnot, and if you can have a shed or not, right? If they're enforced, that's a whole different topic. But any kind of ordinance we have trumps any HOA regulations for solar. Minnesota state law, doesn't it trump an HOA?
No, opposite, actually. There are some states that have
That's not-
enacted statutes that will do exactly what you said, where the state statute will overrule the HOA in that regard. But in
Right.
Minnesota is not one of those states. So if a local community has an ordinance that would permit solar, and this would be whether it's on the roof or the ground, by the way, and a local HOA that was enforcing its rules said no, that's between the HOA and the property owner. The cities are not involved in that
Right.
because that, we're not party to their agreements. But certainly for some folks, that still wouldn't allow them to do
so
either
mi-
option.
So right now, it states here that Minnesota does not have solar access laws, right? That's on page 4, under the HOA section. That's how I read it. Minnesota is one of roughly 50% of states that do not have solar access laws. So the HOA rules in that case because we don't have anything to even oversee it. But what about a city, like an ordinance like this then? Does that
Yeah, and
trump the HOA?
no.
No.
So this is something that more and more states are moving towards in their effort to encourage renewable forms of energy, where they are adopting these solar access laws that basically trump the HOAs or cities' ability to override and say that those things aren't allowed in their communities or their neighborhoods. Minnesota is not currently one of those. It's about half and half right now.
It's evolving, just like the technology is evolving. So the other barrier would be this keeping up with the regulations as the technology changes. I mean,
It's very similar in some regards to the evolution of the satellite dish. When those first came out a few decades ago,
right?
they were huge. And now they've evolved to a small dish that everybody's kind of very accepting of. But when they first came out, this was just as big of an issue for local governments as how do we address these very large satellite dishes? And what do we do with them? And there was concern that some of them would become obsolete, but then just sit on a property in sort of a blighted state, creating an eyesore.
Right.
And that's some of the concern here, that kind of the same trajectory, that the technology is rapidly evolving, and could some of these systems become obsolete technologically and then sit there without being removed or properly disposed of?
But go ahead.
I was just going to say, so for the argument of the technology is changing rapidly, we actually had a pretty solid debate on this topic, lively in the whole 9 yards. But the argument against the technology is changing too rapidly, we should hold off and wait on this was, well, do you hold off on buying a computer or a new car? And
Or anything.
nobody
for
does
matter.
that, knowing that just as soon as you get one of those, that the technology is also changing very rapidly and they're out of date. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear in trying to present the arguments that we had the debate that we had since you guys asked, but, for every argument, there was a kind of counterpoint argument as well during our discussion, if that helps. But we're really interested in what you guys have to say and your decision on this topic.
I think completely eliminating them on the ground is bad. I mean, I can see putting restrictions, and there should be restrictions that it doesn't cause, if there are glare problems, then
There's recourse for that.
there should be, that shouldn't be allowed. But just blanket saying, no, you can't put them on the ground I think is wrong. I think I could easily put them on the ground in my backyard that wouldn't affect anybody.
I agree. I like the idea of allowing homeowners to put them on the ground. You mentioned a possibility would be to have in the ordinance setbacks. Like, what is currently allowed? Is it just kind of like a shed, like 10 feet from your property, or?
The setbacks vary depending on what zoning district you're in. And there's a couple ways that you could handle something like this. You could either treat it just like the rest of your accessory uses and have it follow the setbacks that sheds and swing sets and everything else have to follow. Or you could establish more restrictive and different setbacks. Depending on what your goals are, you know, that may make sense in some circumstances.
What precedents do we have around us as far as like Chaska, Victoria, Waconia? Where are they at on this issue besides the big farm garden, whatever they call them?
Sure. So I did some of that research before the city council meeting, and most of the local surrounding communities in Carver County actually do not have ordinances specifically related to solar energy systems. Some of the communities on the northern side of the metro have started going into and exploring that quite a bit more in the northern side of the metro for some reason than down here. The ones that I found predominantly do allow the ground-mounted solar, if they have a full solar energy ordinance where they've actually thought through and, you know, defined all of these different items as opposed to some glancing mention of solar in their ordinance. So most of them do allow them on the ground. They do put different restrictions on them or additional conditions as to how they have to be constructed. You know, maybe it's that the solar panel itself can't exceed 200 square feet in size so that you don't, like the one in this picture would be larger than 200 square feet in size, so that it would allow for you to do something, but maybe not something like that. A lot of them don't allow for them to be in the front yard. Your ordinances already don't allow for the accessory structures in the front yard, so that's not something we'd actually have to write in special. Some of them don't allow it if you can view them from a principal roadway. There's all kinds of different things that we could do, and there's provisions we could write in regarding protecting against glare and some of those other items as well.
I would think it would be really hard to define that visible from a principal roadway. And I'm thinking some of the developments now where the street you drive on is you're really actually always looking in their backyard. Sometimes the backyards are more visible than the front yards with the layout of some of the recent developments.
Right, and that's the risk for anybody, if you did an ordinance that didn't allow it to be viewed from a principal roadway, anybody that has a corner lot or what's called a through lot where their front yard is on a road, but so is their backyard, that would pretty much keep those property owners from being able to do this at all.
Madam Chair, I guess I'm in agreement with the rest of my fellow commission members here that I think preventing them outright is probably not a good thing and not a place where we want to be. I certainly would be in favor of allowing it with certain restrictions, and I'm curious to see what how the other commissioners feel about maybe some restrictions around the size of them as it relates to the different size of lots that we have, because I don't know how large the lots get in Carver, but maybe there's some sort of
Be a formula.
Almost
some
a
sort
ratio.
of formula or something that would allow for some flexibility. The
Thinking sort
beauty,
of like what we do with your sign regulations, where a larger building or a larger lot can have a larger sign.
yep, that's exactly what I'm thinking. And then the other thing I was going to say is, you know, hearing what the council was debating and talking about technology, I think the beauty of an ordinance is that you can revisit that at any time and change it as the needs and the technology evolve and the needs of the community or desires of the community change. So changing that's a fairly straightforward process. So I'm certainly comfortable with proceeding and in favor of proceeding with restrictions. And I guess as long as we're pausing, the other thing I would add is I did read in the background material that in some cases that a glare study was required. It sounds like those glare studies were more geared towards solar gardens, but maybe there could be a modified glare study. There's based on the density and the location, the density of that neighborhood, or just to make sure that there's not going to be an impact, but maybe not to the extent that you would require for some of the larger community solar garden areas.
You know, I would think that there should be some, and I'm not, Carver probably can't set the boundaries, but I would think the manufacturers should have some kind of information on what kind of glare is potential from their products. Certainly, if somebody's going to put up a solar panel, you want to know if it's going to cause glare problems before you put it up.
Well, who wants to know that? I mean, the owner?
The owner and the people who live around them.
Right. Well, that's what it always
Around.
comes down to, how much people respect each other's, property.
But there
and their
should be, I would
neighbors.
think there should be information like that. I think the industry needs to do that.
There should be something I could come up with to help
Guide.
mitigate that
Yeah.
glare on that smaller scale. Doing the whole glare analysis study is one thing when it's a large commercial application, because it is sort of, it has a fair amount of cost to do that study. That said, there should be some way through specifying certain types of technology or otherwise that, we could otherwise limit it within here to protect against the glare.
And then, looking at samples of ordinances already written to maybe help guide our perspective here a little bit, or things to think about that we might not be thinking about.
And Madam Chair, I would just say that I've had an opportunity probably over the last year and a half, just in my day work, to be involved in the development of ordinances for a certain city as it relates to solar areas. And I would say that what is presented here, has been presented here, is fairly consistent with everything that I've seen recently. That's worth. I do have a question though, Madam Chair and Cindy. On page 3, we talk about the height not to exceed, and I think we're just using that as an example, that typically if you mount something on a roof that it wouldn't exceed 15 feet. I did notice in the draft ordinance that we had 10 feet in there. So I just wanted to check in and make sure that that was a deliberate 10 feet. And
I will double check on that when I go back and edit after this meeting.
thank you.
Have you heard of any demand from the public for this? Informally?
Well, this draft ordinance and the moratorium that goes along with it came about because we did receive an inquiry about a community solar garden
A community solar garden.
as a principal use on a piece of property in the city.
So that's different than what we're talking about, a freestanding, or no?
No, it's a freestanding, but it's where you have hundreds of panels occupying 5 to 10 acres of land,
Okay.
and that's the sole use of the property, as opposed to a situation like this, which caused us to look at the whole ordinance. 'Cause
Okay.
so you can't tackle,
A
when
piece
your
of
ordinance
it.
doesn't address any of it to a great extent to begin with, it's hard to just tackle the community solar gardens without tackling the rest of it as well. So that's why we're now talking about accessory ones at the same time.
Madam Chair, and then Cindy, this question's probably related to, or going over your way here. As it regards to the historic preservation in those areas, I'm just, in my read of the existing ordinance and the changes that are being proposed, that there would be no change to what was previously discussed at this time in the historic district. I think when we talked about this last time, when it came before us, that we did have some long discussions about what those impacts would look like in the historic district, particularly making sure that you're not compromising the integrity of those buildings and the historic structures. So I just wanted to make sure that the intent was to not allow or extremely limit the use in those historic areas.
Yes, the way the ordinance is currently drafted, the two districts that encompass your historic district, which are your traditional neighborhood district as well as your central business district, this would not be allowed as an accessory use at this time. It's a topic of debate whether this type of technology, when incorporated into a historic property, has impact or not upon the integrity of the building as well as its place in the district. And so at this time, it's intentionally been left out.
Thank you.
I noticed in the draft of the ordinance on the page 4, the wind energy is mentioned, which seems very relevant. Do we have anything in place in a current ordinance, or is this the first time it's being addressed to have that included?
The reason that that's in there now is it's a function of how ordinances are drafted. So if you look at page 3, it says Section 8, repeal and replace. So Section 50.99 of your ordinance is being repealed in its entirety, and a new Section 50.99 is added as follows. So I took out the little bit of text that was related to solar energy and replaced it with all the solar energy you see here. But this wind energy section is already in your ordinance. And because the convention of how we do the repeal and replace, to keep the wind energy part intact, I have to add it back in here then.
Oh, thank you. You explained that well.
Do you need anything from us tonight, or
I think
just our comments?
generally we're looking for your comments. You know, on first it was, you know, very specifically on the one issue, but if you have any other suggestions or things you would like to see, we'd be looking for those comments at this time as well. Again, with the goal of bringing this back to your May meeting for the actual public hearing.
Madam Chair, I would just say, I think this is really well thought out. I think that you have done an incredible amount of research and work that went into both the background and the ordinance itself. It sounds like, to me, it looks like we're on the right track, and I'm certainly would, again, I said this earlier, but would support the ground-mounted systems with those restrictions. And if we could somehow address the glare piece, as that seems to be coming up, that would be my feedback. So thank you for the time and efforts put into this.
Is there anything in the ordinance about removing it when it's no longer in use?
I can certainly look at adding that.
I think that certainly would be something we should put in and have some kind of definition of when it's no longer in use. It's not provided power in 6 months or something.
I would agree. I would note in here on the staff background, on the background report on page 3, there was mention of the
Yeah, but I don't see
decommissioning,
it.
but expanding on that and putting something in the ordinance, I agree that's a good idea.
Probably go great on the roof of the new city hall.
It's in the central business district.
Okay, I just have a clarifying question on the very back page, number 4. When they talk about the solar glare hazard analysis tool, is that something that would be done each time somebody would want to, they would actually like apply to do this, right? Or they would, how would the process really look?
And that is specifically in the section related to those community solar energy
Okay.
systems, so the solar gardens that are on the larger installments.
Right, so you don't see
Again-
that as a neighborhood type of,
No, it's not completely practical to do it on that smaller scale setting. But like I said, I can come up with some other ways to mitigate the glare on that smaller application basis.
sure. Like a mini tool?
I'm not exactly sure what that's gonna look like yet. But what I wanna do is come up with a way that makes it affordable, because if we're adding it to the ground-mounted systems, then I think we should add it to the roof-mounted ones as well, because
To be
depending on,
consistent?
you know, the building height and stuff, and just general topographical change, especially in Carver where you have a little bit of topography, the roof-mounted systems could cause glare just as easily as the ground-mounted ones. So I do want to find something that is, that will mitigate the issue, but is also affordable.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts or questions?
No questions?
Anything else from that point?
Not on this topic.
Okay, so then moving on to 5.2. The City Hall site plan.
Thank you. In your packets is a copy of the City Hall site plan for your review and consideration this evening. The site plan review is a process that's required by the city code. The site plan, of course, depicts not just the, how it looks on the ground, but also those architectural renderings of the building. Your HPC did review the plan at their meeting this month and recommended approval of the elevations on a 5-0 vote. And the council has approved the project plans, specs, and advertisement of bids for the project at this point in time. The staff recommendation is in the packets, including 4 conditions to be met as the project proceeds down its path. Happy to answer any questions that you have. And we do have the, a couple more slides that show the footprint of the building and the layout. It's a 2-story building, of course. You've probably all seen this a few times now. And the exterior elevations of all 4 sides of the building.
Madam Chair, if I could. Cindy, so tying it back to our previous discussion on solar, changing, evolving technology, changing needs, changing desires, and we, of course, know that this is in the historic district, and so solar currently not allowed on this building. But in terms of future proofing our new city hall, solar roof panels could be something that we would consider in the future, or could consider in the future if things changed. And so I know to do that you can't just put any old roof on there. You would need to make sure that you have, that roof is reinforced, so in the future, should things change and the stars align and the council just had an appetite to move forward in that direction, that the roof would be able to support that sort of change. In the conversations that you've had with the architects and the engineers on this project, is that roof capable of supporting solar should we want to go that way in the future?
And I apologize, that's not a question that I can answer, but I would be happy to pass that thought along regarding resiliency in the future to Brent and the city council.
Thank you.
Do you have any idea what the mechanical screens are on the roof?
What the mechanical screens are?
Yeah, they have on all of these views, they show on the roof RTV mounted mechanical screen.
I apologize, I do not know what those are.
Maybe you're right. That's,
So it's kind of like on the elementary school where they had the ceiling mounted, roof mounted mechanical units, and then they put up the screening just so you don't see it and it's not
okay,
perceived
so
as an
you think
eyesore.
they're to hide stuff?
What's that?
They're hiding stuff,
Yeah,
ugly stuff. Okay.
exactly.
I mean, I just noticed it for the first time, so I was wondering what they were.
Madam Chair? Cindy, I had a hard time telling from, and maybe it's the size of the print on the elevations themselves, but can you remind us what materials are being proposed?
If you give me a minute, I can look that up for you.
It does look like it's a combination of materials.
I think it was a variety of bricks, different colors.
Stone, I thought.
Sorry, it will take me a minute to find this in the packet. If you want to be talking about other items, I'll jump back to the materials. So the exterior materials are a couple different types of brick, and then it has standing seam metal roofing.
It is, you said it was metal roofing?
Correct, it's standing seam metal roofing.
And
That is on the,
oh, I see it.
there's a little call-out table.
Yep. And also, as it relates to the landscaping plan, I know there's some minimal things here, and we didn't get the full landscaping plan, but just what they've shown, it's kind of there's a lot of concrete in that area, so there's not a lot of greenfield space, open space, whatever we want to call it, to actually do some landscaping. So to me, it looks like this is adequate, but I wanted to check in with you to make sure that the landscaping requirements meet the requirements that the city has for this particular site.
So the city doesn't have requirements in terms of, say, a maximum amount of impervious surface or anything like that. And there are not on, this site's actually zoned public institutional. If you recall, actually a few months ago, we rezoned that. In that district, there are not landscaping requirements, so it would meet, since there aren't any, it would meet those requirements.
Yeah, the landscaping to me did look minimal, but based on the space that they have to work with, it seemed adequate to me, so I don't know if,
They'll have plastic
Comments?
plants inside.
We want to beautify the outside.
And I think that's the challenging part. It is a very small site, as we all know. But if you consider the overall downtown development pattern, the intent of it is to have that 0-foot setback from your side and your front property lines, which doesn't, in that traditional historical sense, doesn't leave room for a lot of exterior landscaping.
This is above the floodplain, right?
This area is above the floodplain.
Somebody asked me the other day. So.
Cindy, what was your answer again? How did you word it? What did you say?
To which question?
To Jim's question about,
It's outside of the floodplain.
thank goodness.
Well, it's outside the 100-year floodplain. It's probably not on the, outside the 500-year floodplain.
I think it's outside of that, too.
Think so?
Any other questions? Thoughts? Anything else, Cindy, for us?
Nope, nothing. If you're inclined to make a recommendation to approve this, it would go from here on to the city council for their approval.
I'll make a motion to approve this.
second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Okay, number 6, any communications, updates you want to share? Beside what we already covered?
I just have one quick thing. I mentioned this during the council meeting on Monday night, but it's National Volunteer Week, and you guys are all here tonight because you're volunteers, and so I just wanted to thank you all for your volunteer service to the city, and thank you for your commitment to always reading the packets and the time that's spent on that, and your time away from families and personal and work obligations to be here on these evenings. So thank you very much.
Great. Yep. Yes, I second that. Thank everybody. Okay.
I would just like to say that this Friday at Sticks, Carver Lions are putting on a pork chop feed, which is usually very good. And I will add, this may be the last meeting where I have glasses.
Because of progressive technology.
Yes.
Congratulations. Okay, make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 See, I'm
Motion
already
carried.
halfway there.
Oh.
Well, I've got these.
Mechanical